And welcome to another History Burst video. This one's going to focus on poverty in Elizabethan England. Now, there were many reasons why poverty and vagabondage increased in Elizabethan England, and this included population growth, bad harvests, sheep farming and enclosure. So what actually classed then as poverty in Elizabethan England? Well, you were in poverty if you spent 80% of your income on bread, if you were unemployed or ill, meaning you could no longer provide for yourself or your family, if you were unable to afford the rising cost of food, and if you needed help or charity, also known as poor relief and alms. There were different types of poor. We had the deserving poor, which included widows or women abandoned by their husbands and their families, as women were paid very little. It included the sick and the elderly who were unable to work, orphan children, and 40% of the poor were actually under 16, and in people on low wages. We also then have the undeserving poor, and this included itinerants, vagrants and vagabonds. And these were homeless people who moved from their own parish looking for work, and they were often involved in crimes and were those in authority in Elizabethan England. Now, vagrants had no permanent home, whilst vagabonds were idle and dishonest. There were several reasons for the increase in this poverty. One of the major reasons was population growth, and the population grew from 3 million in 1551 to 4.2 million by 1601. And this increased demand for food, which drove up prices, whilst increasing the labour supply, which drove down wages. And this meant many ordinary people could no longer provide for themselves or their families. The knock-on of this was that towns began to grow, and between 1500 and 1600, towns such as London and Norwich expanded. And this drove up the cost of rents, while food prices also rose as food had to be brought in from rural areas to be sold. Alongside this was an increasing demand for land. As the population increased, more people needed land, which drove up rents and resulted in what we call entry fees, and these were upfront sums paid at the start of a land rental. Now, many people could not afford to pay those. Sheep farming was another factor, and the growth of the wool trade after 1500 meant many farmers preferred to rear sheep rather than grow food, and the rearing of sheep required less labour. In order to kind of maximise the amount of profit from sheep, enclosure was encouraged from 1500 onwards, and land was split and divided into fields for animals, arable land, or for both, up and down farming, and it was given to farmers who farmed for profit. Now, this denied people the use of common land, or land that could be used by everyone, which meant they were unable to provide for their families. And enclosure drove many people off the land altogether, leaving them with nowhere to live or farm, and they became itinerants and vagrants. In the 1580s, the economy began to shrink, resulting in an economic recession, and this was due to trade restrictions such as those involving Spain over its involvement in the Netherlands, and this created unemployment and therefore poverty. There was a series of bad harvests in 1562, 65, 1573, 1586 and the 1590s, and this hit subsistence farmers, or those who ate what they grew, and reduced the food supply and drove up prices. Another factor for the increase in poverty was the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, religious houses had provided charity throughout the Middle Ages, but their dissolution under Henry VIII in the 1530s meant that those who were struggling had nowhere to go for support. The Elizabethan government responded to the problem of poverty in different ways, and over time attitudes towards the poor began to shift. So traditional attitudes towards the poor meant that many Elizabethans distinguished between the deserving or the impotent poor, the old and the sick who could not help themselves, and the idle poor, or those who could work but chose not to do so. And it was felt that the poor should be given every opportunity to better themselves. Those who refused to do so should therefore be punished. Many Elizabethans remained suspicious of the poor and demonised them as counterfeits and criminals. Vagrants and vagabonds who deceived or threatened the public were dealt with severely, and they could be whipped, imprisoned, enslaved, or even hanged if caught begging. But why did attitudes change? Well, attitudes towards the poor changed during Elizabethan times. There were various reasons for that. There was the fear that poverty led to disorder and was a potential cause of rebellion. The cost of dealing with the poor, especially the poor rates. The population changes and enclosures meant the poor were an increasingly visible presence in Elizabethan England, and changing economic circumstances, including problems with the wool trade, bad harvests, and enclosure, forced the authorities of Crown, Parliament, and the Justices of the Peace to develop a more constructive attitude towards poverty. So we can see different policies towards the poor in Elizabethan times. So we have the poor rate and charity. Now this shows elements of continuity. These measures had existed before Elizabeth's reign, and they continued throughout the Tudor times. Now the poor rate was a local tax organised by Justices of the Peace, or JPs, with the proceeds spent on improving the lives of the poor. The poor were given money or things to make and sell. Whereas charity was often funded by local wealthy people who gave their names to the charitable foundation. For example, Lady Cecil's bequest for poor tradesmen in Romford. We then start to see progressive approaches, which is where the government's response to increased unemployment caused by fools in the wool trade shows how they try to now help the poor. We have the Statute of Artificers in 1563, which says that those refusing to pay the poor rates could be put in prison, and officials who failed to organise the poor relief could pay a penalty of up to £20. And we then have the 1576 Poor Relief Act, which says Justices of the Peace were required to provide the poor with wool and raw materials to enable them to make and sell things. The poor who refused to do so were sent to a special prison known as the House of Correction. We then see a repressive type of change to the approach to the poor, where the change targeted vagrants, and Parliament felt that vagrants posed a threat to public order and had to be deterred through harsh punishment. Yet the Vagabonds Act of 1572 also recognised the need to help the poor by providing them with work. Now, this law said that vagrants were whipped and had a hole drilled through each ear as a mark of shame toward others of their vagrancy. They were imprisoned if arrested again for vagrancy. They were given the death penalty for a third offence, and the Act introduced a national poor rate to provide support, including money and work for the impotent poor. Justices of the Peace had to keep a register of the poor, and those in authority, so JPs, parish councils and so on, were tasked with finding work for the able-bodied poor. And then we start to see an administrative approach, and this is seen in the 1601 Elizabethan Poor Law. And the change came about and it standardised the treatment of the poor across England. Now the impotent poor were cared for in almshouses or poorhouses. The able-bodied poor were sent to work in a house of industry or a workhouse. The idle poor were sent to a house of correction or a prison, and the paupers or poor children therefore became apprentices. Poverty grew to be a major issue in Elizabethan England. It placed a growing financial burden on communities and carried the risk of rebellion. The Elizabethan government was concerned about the increasing numbers of the poor and acted to resolve the issue for a range of different reasons. So one reason was, as the number of poor grew, it became increasingly expensive to look after them, especially in the 1590s after the poor harvests. Now, this put a financial burden on taxpayers who, under the terms of the 1572 Poor Law, had to pay the Poor Law tax to provide relief for the poor, and the government therefore needed to act to reduce this tax burden. Many Elizabethans began to feel threatened by the poor, whom they saw as a potential threat to their property and their safety, as well as a source of rebellion. And this was particularly the case in the 1590s, when poor harvests and falling wages led to unrest in the countryside, especially in Oxfordshire and Devon. Now, government action was needed to control the poor and prevent future rebellions. Attitudes towards the poor had begun to change. Now, before the Reformation in the 1530s, when the English Church became Protestant, People had felt a responsibility to provide alms or charity for the poor as a way of shortening their time in purgatory, which is a place Catholics believed you would go to after death. However, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII had led to a decline in these Christian values, and so people were less sympathetic towards the poor in the Elizabethan period. The poor became increasingly visible in many Elizabethan towns, provoking hostility from wealthier people. This hostility was reinforced by stereotypes of the poor and vagrants that suggested they were both threatening and deceitful, and this meant that many beggars were physically attacked and driven out of town, again putting pressure on the government to act. Now, poverty was an increasing problem, a growing problem in Elizabethan England, and the population had grown from 3 million to 4.2 million. The situation was made worse by rising prices and debased coinage, or the falling value of money, and many people, even in work, could no longer afford to provide themselves and their family. Now, poverty was particularly bad in London, which during Elizabeth's reign became the most heavily populated city in Europe. Now, London was a magnet for the poor who flocked there from elsewhere looking for work, and this created a serious problem with vagrancy. The government then had tried all of these different measures, but how effective were they? Well, the Elizabethan government put various measures in place to deal with the poor, and these had some successes in reducing poverty. One success was that poor relief became the responsibility of government, including local governments, especially parishes, rather than individual charities, and this meant the poor were provided for and did not starve. As a result, even in the 1590s, when the harvests were poor, there was no rebellion or disorder. Elizabethan poor laws, especially the Poor Law Act of 1601, remained in place for a long time, suggesting that this legislation was successful. However, government measures failed to tackle the underlying causes of poverty, such as low wages, enclosure, poor harvests, a rising population, and this meant the problem of poverty continued throughout the 17th and the 18th century. Join us next time as we look at voyages of discovery in Elizabethan England.